The name is Robert Hardman. He's royal. Is your official title royal editor for the Daily Mail?
No. I'm a columnist. I write about all sorts of other things, but I do write books and documentaries about the monarchy, and I have been doing so for some years.
The reason he's here is because of this marvellous book, just simply called Charles III. Now, we could talk, just you and I, for the rest of the hour, but I do want to get some of our listeners on air in a few minutes' time. 0345 6060 973 if you have a question for Robert. Now, let's talk a little bit about the coronation, and then move on maybe to the future and what he wants his reign to be like. The coronation was an amazing spectacle, but it was different to previous coronations. I mean, there was the element of tradition, but also modernity.
Yeah, I mean, superficially, if you look today, it just looked like, all the coronations since the dawn of time. A lot of the rituals are the same, things like the anointing, crowning. I mean, these are things that go back to pre-Norman conquest. But at the same time, he was very conscious, the new king, that he wanted this to be a coronation that, if you like, reflected the Britain over which he was going to be king. And so if you look at a lot of the detail, some of the liturgy, you just see how it is completely different. And while I was writing my book, actually, I was given access, I had to be approved by the king himself, to the Royal Archives to look at the files on the coronation of 1953. And you look at the planning for that, and it's involving all the prime ministers of all the realms, and it's an establishment production following pretty much the blueprint of the one before and the one before and the one before. And it's a service that is conducted almost entirely by elderly, white, Anglican male clergy. That's it. Even the Church of Scotland gets a sort of a small walk-on part. Roman Catholic Church nowhere, other faiths nowhere. This time around, from the very start of this service, I thought it was very compelling that the first voice we heard at the coronation wasn't that of the Archbishop of Canterbury. It was of that 14-year-old choir boy who goes up to the king and effectively says, "What are you doing here?" And he says, "I'm here to serve." And all coronations traditionally are all about, this is the big king, this is the new monarch, this is the person we bow down and revere and pay homage to. But this one was all about the Charles III saying, this is about service. I am here to serve. All these extraordinary crown jewels. You're not giving me expensive diamonds and scepters and rings. What you're doing, you're giving me the implements by which I can bring about mercy and justice and all the things that they represent. And it was much more pronounced than previously. And of course, it had women part of all clergy, female clergy. That simply hadn't happened in 1953. You had all the major faiths involved in one way or another. You had all the different communities of Britain reflected. It was a very, very compelling and very different and actually rather shorter coronation, because the hereditary peerage weren't there, or actually there was a sort of token presence.
And a smaller one, because weren't there 8,000 people in the Abbey for 1953, and this time it was about 2?
They did. In 53, they put scaffolding right up to the rafters and managed to cram in 8,200 people. And, there is simply no way that under modern health and safety regulations that was going to happen. So it was a regular Abbey congregation, if you like, of just over 2,000.
Do you know if the king enjoyed it? Because, I don't know about you, but if it was me, I'd be thinking, oh my God, don't let anything go wrong. Don't let the crown fall off or whatever. Can you actually enjoy that kind of experience?
It's fascinating you say that, because at the same time as writing the book, I was also writing a documentary, a BBC documentary, alongside all the build-up and around the coronation. And actually we had a camera was there in the palace, both before, during and after. And as he comes out to get in the carriage to go to the Abbey, he is in a very good mood. He's sort of flapping his robes, and he even cracks a joke with his equerry, and he's sort of flapping his robes as if he's like Superman. He goes, I can fly, He's trying to make sure everybody is sort of in the right mood. And I thought both he and Queen Camilla, actually, they were both very composed. Of course, it's incredibly stressful, and we all know that in the build up to it, there was lots of talk about what sort of demonstrations might there be? As well as Republicans, could it be environmental protesters or whatever? So you've got all that going on in the back of your mind, And because of the nature of modern news, I mean, this is going to be by far and away the most watched coronation because the whole world's got TV and internet and is watching. So there's so much riding on it. And yes, you can see, knowing him, over the years I've followed him a lot, I've interviewed him quite a few times, I could tell that, there are stressful moments. But again, you look towards the end of it, particularly, for example, when he comes out onto the terrace back at the palace, and there are 4,500 from across all the forces, servicemen, servicewomen from all the forces lined up, and they do that 3 cheers, and that really, you could see the look on his face. I mean, that's a sort of gulp moment for him. And yes, he was relieved. I mean, you see some of the pictures, some of the footage back in 1953 of the Queen when she gets back to the palace, and there's just this sense of, oh my goodness, that we can kick our shoes off now. And there was a touch of that as well.
I think Penny Mordaunt said that he winked at her on the way out, which I think she deserved a wink. I
interviewed her for the book. She was very interesting as well because she did. We all remember her as the lady with the sword. She actually had to hold 2 swords.
Yeah.
And she said that actually one bit of advice for future sword bearers, she said, don't put your heels on until the last minute. That's what she did. But she made the point to me that even on the way out, the king didn't just wing it. He actually complimented her and said, you did very well. And she said she was very touched by that because all the things he had going on that day, he still remembered to congratulate her for what she'd done.
And I think she's auctioning her dress off for charity, isn't she?
She wondered what to do with it, and she decided, I think, rather than auction it, because she didn't want it to be a sort of undignified Scrabble, or it suddenly ends up in a sort of prize or on a lesser radio station, should we say? She wanted to do it, make sure that it was done properly. So I think she's arranged a private sale of it, and all the proceeds will go to charities of her choice. But she was quite interesting how she chose that, because all previous Lord Presidents of the Council who did what she did had been elderly men, so they just wore either peerage robes of the peerage or mourning coats, and in her case she had this special dress made, and she thought long and hard about the colour, and in the end she told me the colour was Poseidon, to reflect her naval constituency and her naval career.
And of course, I suppose in this country we tend to think of him as King of Great Britain, Northern Ireland. But of course, he's king of 14 different nations, isn't he?
14 other ones as well as...
And he's head of the Commonwealth.
Yeah.
And given his upbringing and his knowledge of what that all meant to the Queen, how important is the sort of international aspect of his reign going to be, do you think?
I think it's hugely important. I mean, he once made a delightful speech the first time he represented the Queen at a Commonwealth summit. I was there, it was in 2013. And you could see the sort of other leaders. He was there because the Queen, by this stage, had given up long-haul travel. And you could see them thinking, oh, it's a pity the Queen isn't here. And he did this very nice speech where he just talked about growing up around all the sort of founding fathers of the Commonwealth. And he talked about how he knew President Nkrumah of Ghana, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Kenneth Kaunda, and he basically was just sort of name-dropping Commonwealth greats he had known. And you suddenly saw around the room everyone thinking, actually, this guy knows more about the Commonwealth than anybody else, with the exception of his mother. And he'd been touring the Commonwealth really all through his adult life, and he understands it. I mean, I've been on Commonwealth tours with him, and he understands the difference between, you've got the Commonwealth overall, which is a huge mix of republics and monarchies, and some of whom have serious problems with Britain and have had historic issues of Britain and still do. And then you've got the Commonwealth realms, which are those countries of which he's head of state. And as we said, there are 15 of those: Australia and New Zealand, Jamaica and Antigua and Canada. And he understands that, being king of all those places, you've got to you've got to make the effort. You've got to engage with them, and so he's very connected to in each of those countries. He has his Governor General, his representative there, and he's fully up to speed on what's going on in all those places. You see his red box when they come sometimes 2-3 times a day. It's not just British state papers that he has to look at and handle and sign, but other ones too.
And how's he coping with the fact that he's been diagnosed with cancer, but he's still got his duties to perform? He's not doing public-facing duties at the moment. But I mean, that will be an enormous burden to him, that he isn't able to do that sort of thing at the moment.
Yeah, well, he loves the public facing side of it. I mean, I thought it was very telling that immediately the day after the death of the Queen, and he flew back down to London and came down to the palace with Queen Camilla, but stopped the car outside the palace, didn't go inside, stopped it outside, and went straight out into the crowds. And you talk to all the people around him, they say, he does love crowds. I mean, he does. Obviously he's not seeing crowds at the moment, but I mean, it's a source of considerable irritation to his staff that, trying to drag him out of a crowd isn't easy, and things tend to overrun. So that side of things, he'll be missing that. But I'm told he's in very good spirits, and he's also, he's not just confined to Sandringham as he was in the early days of his diagnosis. He's moving around. He's been down at Windsor. He's made himself the ranger of the Great Park at Windsor. He's been quite busy out there because he's walking around and still meeting prime ministers and having audiences. And the one-to-one stuff carries on. The red boxes carry on. But what he can't do is go into enclosed spaces full of lots of strangers on doctor's advice.
Right, we are going to come to your calls in a moment, so keep them coming. 0345 6060 973 if you have a question for Robert Hardman. It's 8:32. Let's get the news headlines from Daryl Jackson.
Rishi Sunak says there won't be a general election on May the 2nd, the same day as local elections. The Prime Minister says it is his working assumption it will take place in the second half of the year. GPS signals were reportedly blocked by Russia on an RAF plane carrying Defence Secretary Grant Shapps. Newspaper journalists on board said mobile signals disappeared for about half an hour. And Community Secretary Michael Gove has named some of the groups to be investigated under a new definition of extremism. They include the Muslim Association of Britain and the British National Socialist Movement. LBC weather, persistent rain easing in Northern Ireland and Scotland tonight. Some heavy showers for England and Wales and a low of 2 degrees.
This is LBC.
global player, you can see the cover of this magnificent tome. Charles III, The Inside Story by Robert Hardman. We've been talking about it for the last half an hour. I want to go to some calls, but there's so much that we haven't covered yet, but hopefully the callers will bring up some of these subjects. Delroy's in Brixton. He'll kick us off. Hello, Delroy.
Hello, Ian. Hello, Robert. Thank you for taken my call. I just wonder what Robert's view is on King Charles. Obviously, we both wish him a very healthy, recovery, and hope he gets over all the issues, obviously. But in terms of his constitutional position, I think there are growing concerns about his often political statements, particularly his allegiance to, but as a fondness for the World Economic Forum and this whole green agenda and what have you. Do you, Ian, indeed, and Robert, think that this is a bit of sort of monarchic overreach, or do you think he's perfectly entitled, even within our constitution, to have such views and not to remain totally neutral in the modern age?
Well, Delroy, I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, one of the things we've noticed since the King's become monarch is he stopped really making the sort of speeches that I think you're talking about. I mean, he, over pretty much 50 years, he was quite outspoken, as is very well known, on issues. I mean, in the early days of his environmental campaigning, these were considered quite radical views, although they're now the sort of the orthodoxy. I mean, when he started his Prince's Trust in the late 70s with the contents of his Royal Navy pension, elements within Mrs. Thatcher's government and the traditionalists at Buckingham Palace in the Queen's office, they thought this was highly dubious and he shouldn't really be getting into issues to do with inner city regeneration and youth opportunities. And yet, he did it. I think what we've seen since he's become king is that the only speeches that he makes in public now, I mean, they are, as they say, on advice. So everything gets sort of run past the elected government of the day. So if people were worried about him having particularly radical views in the past, he can't really have them now because he's monarch.
And to be fair, Delroy, I can't think of a single occasion since he's been king where he's got himself into any trouble over uttering an opinion. Can you?
Well, I vaguely, I mean, I should have done some research before I made this call. I think there was some recent collab with Klaus Schwab and the Davos Brigade. I think that went down not greatly in the public court of public opinion. But having said that, you're probably right. Since the coronation, he hasn't done anything. I just think that in terms of people's adherence to our constitution, this neutrality about the king representing the people in Parliament, for example, that is pretty sacrosanct. That he's got to be really, really careful. And I'm sure he is, and I'm sure his advisors
I think you're right, Delroy. I think you're right. He does have to be careful, and I think it was very interesting, before he became king, and even just after he became king, you did have his critics who were sort of saying, well, he's going to have to look out, he's going to have to be very careful because he's going to overstep the mark, he's going to cross a line. And he didn't, actually. I think his critics were waiting for that to happen, and it didn't. And you look at, well, what have been the most controversial things? And you probably got to sort of say, well, his choice of a Greek tie, perhaps, after Rishi Sunak refused to meet the Greek Prime Minister. But again, then, I mean, was it a Greek tie? He is, after all, his grandmother and his grandparents were Greek, after all. That there hasn't really been anything, I would say, that amounts to what we would call a sort of constitutional crisis. Well, not from him, anyway. I mean,
in December, he told the COP28 climate conference that the planet is, quotes, dreadfully off track in reaching key climate goals, adding, our grandchildren won't be asking what we said. They'll be living with the consequences of what we did or didn't do. Now, I wouldn't say that crossed a line.
No, I don't. I mean, that's a slightly, I would say, a slightly watered down version of what he'd said many, many times before. But B, that would have been done on advice. That would have been fully cleared by the Foreign Office and the Prime Minister. And actually, I mean, he is, if you like, one of the sort of founding fathers of COP. I mean, we're now on COP 28. It was a summit that he organised in Brazil back in, 1990, I think it was, which was a sort of precursor to the Earth Summit that led on to COP1. So, I mean, if you like, he goes back to, he's a sort of pre-COP copper.
Delroy, thank you for that.
Thank you, Delroy.
Pauline in Woking says, what does Robert think of Kate's Mother's Day photo fiasco? Why was it an issue? Usual media rubbish? Leave them alone. All of the royals have had bereavements and various health issues, and they don't need this intrusion and disrespect.
Well, Pauline, I mean, it's the talking point of the week, isn't it? It's
But why? It's a picture.
Because you're absolutely right. Why? I mean, given that actually royal photographs have been tweaked and doctored for many years. I mean, if you actually go back to the famous 1953 Cecil Beaton coronation photo of the Queen sitting in Westminster Abbey. I mean, that was actually taken at Buckingham Palace, and it's a fake backdrop behind us. So, I mean, we can go all the way back then to talk about things being touched up. I think part of the problem was because this comes after a prolonged period where nobody has seen the princess. There was obviously great interest, and because there is such a live debate out there over everything to do with AI, artificial intelligence, these sort of things came together. Some people would argue, and I have some sympathy with this idea, that I mean it was a hell of a reaction by the picture agencies to suddenly say we won't touch this anymore. I mean, I can't think of how many celebrity photos are out there that haven't had some sort of work done on them, and particularly given the circumstances of this one. But set against that, the Waleses have long made a point of doing amateur photography, doing it themselves, taking pictures on phones and putting them out. And I think if you are going to say, we like doing amateur shots and not having professional shots, then keep them amateur.
Gordon in Hampstead says, I enjoyed reading Charles III very much. Robert, you say of William that he's not much of a reader, dislikes serious music, but does enjoy TV box sets. It didn't sound altogether promising. Have I got that wrong?
Well, Gordon, no, I mean, I did say he's not fond of reading. I mean, that's one of the things I discovered. He's not. His father loves books. I mean, is a voracious reader. And now I tried to find out, who is the Prince of Wales's favourite author, and led to understand I think one of his closest friends said he's more of a box set guy. But I mean, in that regard, he's not that different to much of the country. I mean, you and I, Iain, we'd love people to buy more books, but
wouldn't we? Well, I'll tell you what, you've made one sale today, because Susie has texted to say, I think for the Queen to be able to die at Balmoral was perfect, as she was happiest there. I believe Charles will be a great king. Is it possible to buy the book now, please? Well, it is possible. If you go online to any bookshop online, you will be able to buy it, or just go into your local bookshop tomorrow, and it is available now. When did it come out?
It came out
not that long ago.
January, towards the end of January. So it's out there now. It's in the shops.
Well, we have lots more to discuss. If you'd like to ask Robert a question, 0345 6060 973. It's 8:45.
LBC.
Hardman will be here for another 10 minutes taking more of your calls. And after 9, the comedian and former teacher Jeff Norcott will join me to talk about his new TV documentary about whether going to university with all the costs and the student debt is really worth it for most young people. And Jeff will tell us what he found, and he'll also be taking your calls on the costs of higher education. Now, we're going to come to Wayne in Boston in a moment, but before we do, I just want to ask you about the whole Republican debate. As I said earlier, I thought there would be a big debate by now, but there isn't. There's no sign of a big sort of Republican movement in this country. Do you think there ever will be?
It doesn't look like it for now. I mean, you could never be complacent about these things. But like you, Ian, I mean, I did expect there to be more of a reaction after the death of the Queen. And particularly, actually, I thought it would be more pronounced in some of the King's realms, because you've got, at the moment, you have a Republican Prime Minister in Australia, for example, who's actually appointed a Minister for the Republic. There are quite strong Republican noises coming out of some of the realms in the Caribbean, and I thought that, you know, some of these governments might take this as a cue. But I think actually what the change of reign underlined was the fact that monarchy actually brings with it extraordinary stability. I mean, that was one of the things that struck me most about that week was we changed our head of state and our head of government in the space of 3 days, and there wasn't an angry word, not a shot fired. I mean, in some countries that'd be a recipe for civil war. We just sort of got on with it. And I think people do, at times like that, they stand back and they realise, well, okay, it may be irrational. If you were starting a new country tomorrow, you wouldn't pick one family and hand them all this wealth and privilege in perpetuity. But we are where we are. Constitutional monarchy works. It's why nobody else can get their hands on the armed forces or the judiciary or the honours system and all these things. They are, as it were, protected through this system, and it's one that appeals not just in Britain but to all the King's other realms and some of the most progressive democracies in Europe as well.
Here's a great question from Cliff in Bishop Stortford. Could Robert please demystify the weekly audience between the monarch and the Prime Minister? A quaint tradition, or could the monarch actually use it to influence government policy?
The monarch can use it. No, a very, very good question there. I mean, monarchs historically, these events are there are no minutes. It's all private, but we know from ministerial memoirs over the years that kings and queens do express opinions. I mean, George VI, for example, had quite strong opinions over Clement Attlee's choice of Foreign Secretary. He didn't want Hugh Dalton being Foreign Secretary. He had grave concerns about the creation of the National Health Service. He couldn't quite understand how it was going to work, and made these clear. At one point, it said he took his shoe off and waved it at the Prime Minister and said, you know, why should people have free false teeth any more than I should have free shoes? I mean, whether it was exactly like that, we don't know. But I mean, you know, these moments do happen, and there is a sort of honesty there. And I've talked to a number of prime ministers who, you know, they won't get into detail about what went on in their discussions with the late Queen, but they all say they kind of value that discussion, because here's the one person who isn't after your job and who's not going to blab, who's not going to tell anyone else. And
it is the role of the monarch to advise and warn, isn't it?
Yeah, and to encourage, and but not to dictate. And I mean, the late Queen had a way of not disagreeing, but would often say, you know, are you sure? And then, are you quite sure? There was a sort of scale of you know, it might be one raised eyebrow, it might be two raised eyebrows. And you know, we don't know how the King does this, but I mean, he's been talking to politicians for a very long time. I mean, he would be having audiences as Prince of Wales, and I've talked to lots of them from all parties, and they've all valued his input, and he always knows where the line is, you know.
I thought the Crown did a great disservice to this in their depiction of the meetings between Margaret Thatcher and the Queen,
God, yes.
which were just fiction.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose you say all the scenes were fiction.
I do a podcast called Crown Fact or Fiction, and I messed my life going, no, fiction. Yeah, I mean, the depiction of the Queen's relationship with Margaret Thatcher, I thought, was particularly damaging, because in one episode we even saw the Queen conspiring to try and bring down Mrs. Thatcher, ordering her press secretary to go out and spread rumours. And I mean, that's just so far from the truth. And in other books, I've explored that episode very in great detail. Never happened. And again, the Crown, one thing the Crown does with King Charles is it portrays him as Prince of Wales, constantly agitating, telling John Major, telling Tony Blair, look, it's time for the Queen to step aside and make way for a younger man. I mean, that just so didn't happen. I think we have to remember one of the extraordinary things is right to the end, the Queen's authority remained undimmed, and that's because of him.
Right. Brace yourself, Robert. It's Wayne in Boston. Hello, Wayne.
Hello, Ian. You've knocked it out of the park this evening. Brilliant show.
Thank you. What
Wayne.
What would you like to ask?
Well, Robert, good evening.
Hello, Wayne.
I feel that I am in great company. Sorry, Ian. I'm going to be a bit nitpicky now. You know the documentary, Robert, before the Crown was they did the rehearsals, yes?
Yes, yeah.
And I was watching the Crown go on the King's Head, and he said, I will let you know when it feels comfortable. Now, I was so deeply disappointed when I was watching it. The Archbishop of Canterbury made 3 attempts at that crown. Now, that footage will be there for a millennium. And that really saddens me. He didn't get it in the first go.
Well, you're right to a point, Wayne. The St Edward's crown, the main crowning crown, if you like, of the coronation, didn't go on entirely smoothly. I think it was 2 attempts rather than 3. And what happened? The Archbishop sort of put it on and then just sort of had a look and then just tweaked it a bit. So it wasn't too bad. But I interviewed the Archbishop because history is full of stories of Archbishops of Canterbury getting things wrong at coronations. So Justin Welby tried very hard to get everything right. One thing he did get right was getting it on the right way round, because that crown, it's very difficult to know which is front and which is back. And he'd worked out there was a little green jewel at the front that was square, and the same jewel at the back was oval. So he would march around the house on the day before the coronation going square front, oval back, square front, oval back, literally as a mantra, so that he got it on the right way round. So, yeah, you're right, Wayne, it wasn't the smoothest crowning, but at least it was on the right way round.
Wayne, thank you very much for that. Roslyn is in Thamesmead. Good evening. What would you like to ask?
Hello, Ian. Hello, Robert. Thank you for taking my call. I'm thoroughly enjoying the conversation. Just to say, I met the King on his very first day of reign outside Buckingham Palace when he met the crowd. Oh. And I was holding the flag of Trinidad and Tobago. And he came over. When he came over and he shook my hand, and I said to him, it's the flag of Trinidad and Tobago, and on behalf of the Commonwealth and Trinidad and Tobago, please accept my sympathy on the passing of the Queen. And he said, thank you. But Robert, do you think, since it's the first flag of the Commonwealth that the King had touched, do you think he should consider making a visit to Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, Roslyn, how nice to hear.
And Robert would like to accompany him, I suspect.
Well, funny enough, I have actually been to Trinidad and Tobago with him, yeah. He went to Port of Spain some years ago, and it was a great trip. I remember we met up with, we went to one of the big carnival teams getting ready there. I think that's lovely. That's a great anecdote, Roslyn. You'll always be able to say that you presented the King, the new head of the Commonwealth, with the first Commonwealth flag that he touched, and you know he's very keen on all 56 nations of the Commonwealth. Yes, he's king of, as we've discussed, 15 of them, but he's very conscious that this is a global body. He takes it very seriously. It's why that despite the fact that he's not very well at the moment, he still was determined to record the message he did for Commonwealth Day this Monday at Westminster Abbey. And I probably saw you in the crowd that day, Roslyn, because I was there too. It was a very memorable moment.
Roslyn, thank you very much indeed. Final question from me. The role of the Queen Camilla, which, I mean, if you'd said to me even 10 years ago that the country would have accepted Camilla as Queen and embraced her in the way that they have, I wouldn't have believed it. But she's clearly I mean, she's obviously his wife, but she is so integral to him, isn't she?
She is. She's been, as her sister put it to me, she said, she's his rock. And right from, the start of the reign, she's been there at his side. I mean, it was only in February 22 that the late Queen said it was her sincere wish that when the time came, Camilla would be Queen Consort. Up until that point, she was going to be Princess Consort. But no one would have any quarrel with that now, because she has been absolutely...
And the consort bit has just been dropped, hasn't it?
Yes, I mean, it was initially kept on because people would talk about the Queen just after the death of the Queen. It was sort of the Queen Consort. But it's very interesting. The court circular, the official palace document, if you like, it calls her the Queen Consort up to the last entry before the coronation. The next one, she's just the Queen. So the consort bit has now gone.
Well, if you're looking for something to read, do buy Robert's book. It's called Charles III, The Inside Story, New King and Court. It really is a cracking read. I can't endorse it any better than that.
Well, that's very kind of you. I've thoroughly
Robert,
enjoyed it.
thank you very much indeed for coming in.